Right. As Emily said, hello, I am Brittany Ryan. I am from New York State Department of State, Office of Planning, Development, Community Infrastructure. If I speak quietly at all during this presentation, somebody just give me a little sign. I have a tendency of doing that. I also am gonna start by apologizing. I think some of my presentation might be a little bit redundant, but maybe that just means we're touching on the very important parts of watershed planning and watershed characterization. So my goal is just to give you a practical overview of Department of State's watershed planning framework. I know many of you are already doing meaningful work in the watersheds, as we've heard today already. So my goal is just to make sure you walk away knowing how our program can support what you're already working to accomplish. So the Department of State provides a number of or funds a number of activities through the Consolidated Funding Application, or the CFA. This is an annual competitive grant process through New York State, and our program is specifically the Waterfront Revitalization Program, or LWRP. And it offers local governments the opportunity to participate in the state's coastal management program on a voluntary basis. So some eligible activities include planning, which is watershed management planning, also design, construction, and other implementation projects. Municipalities located along coastal water bodies and designated inland water bodies are eligible for funding. The map of eligible municipalities can be found on our Department of State websites. But who can actually apply or actually submit the application? So eligible applicants for LWRP funding through the CFA, those waterways that I spoke about. Counties and regional planning councils can also apply, but to do so, they need to demonstrate that there's a genuine local interest and local support. But you don't need unanimous agreement, but you do need to show that municipalities in the watershed want this work to happen. Additionally, municipalities located in the watershed that have DOS approved watershed management plans may also be eligible for implementation funding. So we now have a map that can be found on our Department of State Gateway, which is the QR code shown on the presentation currently. And that map shows DOS approved watershed management plans, as well as 9-element watershed management plans. So you can scan that QR code, and this is a great resource for identifying existing plans that may be in your area that you might be unaware of, and also a good reference if your watershed is looking to develop your own map.
Brittany, I forgot to share my screen.
Oh, really? Okay.
So I'm so sorry. Everyone's gonna take a breath.
I'll provide the slides.
Okay, thank you, online people, for letting me know.
All right.
Did it go? Okay. Let me get you back to that
Oh,
screen.
no.
Okay. Sorry. I just learned this whole system, so it's not like I really know what I'm doing here. Okay, perfect.
Okay. All right, so although other entities may not be eligible as direct applicants for our LWRP grants, they can be incredibly valuable partners. And in some cases, the right entity can help manage the administrative burden of a grant. And it's something we're exploring depending on your watershed situation. When you go through the DOS funded planning process, grantees are encouraged to establish these partnerships with other organizations. This isn't just a box to check. These relationships can provide opportunity to collaborate with a number of individuals to ensure that comprehensive planning for your watershed is being completed, and they are sometimes what make implementation possible after a plan is complete. One of the biggest challenges we hear from watershed groups is that once a plan is complete, maintaining momentum is difficult. Building those connections during the planning process before you need them does make a real difference. So some useful partners to engage, and we've talked a lot about many already today. Soil and water conservation districts that are already typically active in your watershed, local universities that can assist with data collection and analysis, not-for-profits that often have capacity and community relationships already established, and other municipalities, neighboring towns, counties with shared interests. And the intermunicipal agreements can assist with coordination, and I'll touch on that a little bit in the next slide. The planning process is also a great opportunity to get connected with other state agencies like DEC, DOT, Canal Corporation, who all may be relevant implementation partners later on. The key takeaway here is that intermunicipal watersheds don't need to pick just one municipality to carry everything alone or carry that burden. there are pathways to share that responsibility. So intermunicipal planning is a joint effort of 2 or more municipalities, including counties, to address a common issue, and many of you might be familiar with this already. But these are a powerful tool that are sometimes underutilized in watershed work. So for watershed work, an IMA is a cost-efficient way to protect shared natural resources, and that don't stop at municipal boundaries. Avoid situations where municipalities are working independently and maybe possibly inefficiently. Planning jointly and regionally, which tends to produce a more favorable outcome, and promote shared economic interests like drinking water supply or a tourism driving water body. If there's interest in forming an IMA, DOS staff can help coordinate that once grants are awarded. So I wanted to give a few practical tips specifically for watershed management planning applications if you're considering applying through our program. So first, there's a significance section in our application. So if you've applied for funding through our program in the past, you might be familiar with this section of the application. And if you're not, I encourage you to go online, and the previous year's RFA is available, or a request for applications. And that will define the individual sections that are being scored when you submit an application. So that's a very useful tool if you're considering applying in the future. This specific section asks you about the significance and the impact of your proposed project. And this is where applicants sometimes undersell themselves. So think broadly, what is the economic value of the water resource you're protecting? What are the downstream public health implications? What recreational or tourism economies depend on this water body? And these are the kinds of arguments that strengthen an application. If sitting in this room, that might be a no-brainer, but really hammering that home in the application does make a big difference when we're looking at these applications and scoring. Second, remember that planning goals you establish can shape the requirements and the work plan for an awarded project in the future. So DOS wants watershed plans and plan updates and implementation projects to be tailored to the specific watershed. So there isn't a rigid one-size-fits-all approach. If climate resilience is your community's top priority, or if economic revitalization is the framing that will get local buy-in, the plan should and can reflect that. Third, if your watershed already has prior work done, don't assume that you need to start from scratch if you're applying to our program. We can work with what existing characterizations or maybe older plans might be already completed. And those plans can be updated to reflect data, new data, updated terminology, advances in best management practices, or just current community priorities. This can actually be one of the most efficient paths forward and reduce cost and time. So why bother with a formal planning process at all? Why apply to our grant program? We know that federal and state water quality protections exist, but critical and often underappreciated components of water quality protection does happen at the local level, especially in a home rule state like New York. Water quality touches nearly every aspect of community life. Drinking water, protecting it avoids costly treatment down the road and protects public health. Recreation, many New York State communities' economies are highly dependent on water-related recreation amenities for residents and tourists. And increased harmful algal bloom outbreaks we have seen across the state have emphasized how important our public water resources and our access to it is for our local economies. Community resilience, being prepared for climate-related water cycle changes helps communities bounce back from extreme weather events. There's a David Attenborough quote that I feel captures the importance of watershed planning perfectly. No one will protect what they don't care about, and no one will care about what they have never experienced or what they don't understand. So watershed planning process is partly about generating that care, connecting the residents and municipal officials to their watershed in a way that motivates action. You may think you know what the biggest problem in your watershed is. Maybe there's a stream with severe erosion right next to town hall. The planning process forces you to zoom out, look at the whole picture, and find out where your investment might have the biggest impact. Sometimes the most visible problem isn't the most consequential one, or the one that resonates with important stakeholders. So not every community needs the same type of plan. And I know Emily mentioned earlier that we fund 2 types of watershed management plans. So DOS funds both DOS watershed management plans, and we also fund 9-element watershed management plans that are approved by both DOS and DEC. There are a lot of similarities between the 2 types of plans. Both identify causes of non-point source pollution, involve key stakeholders, and identify restoration and protection strategies. Both are non-regulatory and rely on voluntary action for implementation. And if they are DOS funded, both include descriptions and assessments of local laws and programs within the watershed that might affect the plan moving forward. 9-element plans require additional quantification of loading and estimate reductions, specific data and modeling, and a quality assurance protection plan. Additionally, projects identified and approved 9-element plans are eligible for additional points through some other grant programs. And if you've been told that a 9E would give you a competitive edge in a specific grant program, then that's worth exploring case by case. If your watershed does not have existing monitoring data, a 9-element plan might not be the right starting point. The data requirements can be expensive and time-consuming, and for many communities, a watershed management plan is the more efficient to action. With diving deeper on what plan a watershed needs. So a few things to consider. The first things you want to understand are the water quality concerns, and I know many of you are already doing that work, but not every concern is suited for modeling that is associated with the 9-element plan. Identifying the biggest threats and concerns can help determine what plan is most appropriate. So as an example, invasive species are better addressed through a watershed management plan, but concerns about increasing phosphorus levels might be well suited for a 9-element plan. Algal blooms might be better understood through the modeling process of a 9-element plan, even though BMP's recommendations are normally similar between both types of plants. Another thing to consider, have there been any previous watershed analysis or planning done to help understand what the concerns of the watershed are? If the watershed or community does not know the biggest stressors in the watershed, then a watershed management plan can help understand those concerns and also identify if a 9-element plan is a good option in the future. So is there existing data as well? Data is an important component of any watershed plan. The data requirements are significant in the 9-element plan and have very specific requirements. Environmental Laboratory Approval Program, or ELAP, is a lab certification that's required of all data collected as a part of the 9-element plan to ensure accurate, consistent, and well-documented data collection. If this requirement can reduce the availability of data that's available for modeling and may be preventing older data to be used in modeling. So once a watershed has considered these questions, an examination of budget is needed. Data collection, if necessary, and the modeling required for a 9-element plan can be significantly more expensive than a watershed management plan, which would impact the local match requirement when applying for grant funding. Department of State grants are for 5 years. So if a significant amount of data is required prior to creating the model, a watershed should consider phasing your project and coming in for multiple phases of a project to collection would result in an entire watershed plan, or start with a watershed management plan to help identify information that might be missing. So here's the actual framework of a DOS watershed management plan. Major sections are the executive summary, which is a critical component. This summarizes your findings to partners in the public or others that might not have time, capacity, or understanding to read the full document. Introduction, which establishes your vision, watershed goals, and the public engagement framework. Characterization, which we've obviously touched on a lot today, the description and assessment of the water body, watershed resources, and evaluation of local laws and programs. Watershed management recommendations, identifying those causes of water quality concerns and strategies to address them. Implementation strategy, who does what, when, and with what funding. And then the monitoring and tracking, which is how you'll know if the implementation strategies are working and if goals are being met. The watershed planning and protection approach at Department of State recognizes the need to address not only individual water resources within any given watershed, but also all of the land which the water drains these water bodies. It allows communities to integrate water and land resource protections and restorations within growth management and at the local and regional level, balancing both environmental and economic factors to encourage a healthier, more resilient watershed. Watershed plans ensure that the causes and sources of watershed quality are their concerns are identified, that key stakeholders are involved in the planning process, and that restoration and protection strategies are identified that will address the water quality concerns. Public engagement is woven throughout this entire process. NYS requires a watershed advisory committee, a community outreach plan, and a minimum of 3 public meetings at key milestones. This ensures that the plan reflects the community needs and has local buy-in needed for implementation. So implementation. This can be where the biggest challenges lie. The watershed implementation strategy should inform your approach, but there are a few things to keep in mind when we're working through this process. So trying to maintain that momentum. After a planning process wraps up, energy can dissipate, which I'm sure I have heard that you guys are aware of and experiencing. So when developing watershed plans, identifying priority projects through our program provide guidance on where to start with implementation. But implementation can also be done as opportunities present themselves, even if those opportunities and projects may not be the highest priority item. Sometimes a visible win, something that the community can see and has a willing sponsor for, does more for long-term implementation than tackling one of the more complicated projects first. Watershed plans can be structured so that priorities and strategies remain flexible enough to align with whatever funding opportunities become available. You don't need to do it alone. I think that's been stressed a lot today, and you shouldn't do it alone. If you need help identifying implementation resources or navigating state agency relationships, work with us and other state agencies early. The partnership you build during this planning process may be exactly what you need to be successful in implementation down the road. So just to summarize a little bit, Department of State Watershed Management Program is here to support communities at every stage of this work, from early planning through implementation. If you have an older plan, we can work with what you have. If you're starting fresh, we can help you figure out where the right starting point might be. And if you're wondering if the investment is worth it, the planning process pays off. When it connects your community to resources, partners, and implementation funding you might not have access to otherwise. Thank you so much.